All right, thanks, Ken. We are excited today to have Margie Meacham with us, and she is going to share with us about the neuroscience of infographics. So I'm not going to take any more time. I'm going to turn it right over to Margie. Thanks for being with us today, and thanks for sharing.
Margie? Hi, thanks. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everybody. It is really great to be with you today. I am a member of ATD, and I know what a hard job Janet has as a program director because I used to have to do that and find interesting, informative speakers on a regular basis. So now it's a pleasure to give that back. We're going to jump right in with what do you mean by an infographic? And you're going to notice, by the way, I use some links and so on in these slides, and we are going to share those slides with you, so you'll get those links if you're interested in following up. So who would like to tell me, you can either raise your hand and speak out loud or type us in the chat, give us a definition of what you think of when you think of an infographic. So we're looking for a definition of an infographic. I think I see some people typing.
Let's see. Christina's saying visual aid summarizing more complex information. Tanisha, collage of information. Carolina, visual representation of information with short limited text. Corinne, graphic representation of information. Amy said graphic with info. And Sarah, yeah, I unmuted you if you wanted to tell us your answer. And it looks like you have yourself muted, so maybe you're not in a good spot to talk.
Okay, well, we got a great start with those definitions, and I'm really pleased that the big thing everyone picked up on is that term visual. I have a couple of good examples here, and there's very, very powerful reasons why infographics work so well. Where you're probably seeing them a lot is in social media, particularly news outlets and people who are sharing lots of data at a time, because this is a wonderful way to summarize it. What I wish we saw more ways of, more uses of infographics is actually in our training, because we have to communicate a whole lot of data all the time, and we're going to talk about why they work and how they might work in a learning situation, which is a little bit different than a marketing or a news situation. So we all know an infographic when we see one, and you guys had some great definitions there. We also know that there are a lot of bad ones out there, and my apologies to the people who actually created these, but these are things that are called infographics, and they just drive me crazy because they don't fit a lot of my criteria at all for being an infographic. So what's the first thing that strikes you when you see these, in terms of if you were really trying to get some information out of these two examples? And Ken, you know, I'm having a little trouble seeing the chat, so if you could help me out like you just did, that was perfect. Just help me summarize what they're doing.
We see TMI overload. Cody saying cluttered, hard to discern information. Jennifer says too busy. Joe is saying way too much information, very cluttered. Jessica, busy, too much information. Carolina says not a quick reference, trying to include too much information, difficult to understand, from Tanisha.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous, yeah, and we know that right away, right? We can tell a bad one, but this is one of the biggest beginner mistakes. We put too much on it. And in addition, I would say, at least the one on the left, there's too much text. And these are just boxes. They're not, the shape doesn't really communicate much to us.
Yeah, Elvira saying she actually pointed out the color. She said no clear color scheme.
Right, really crazy. And even in the one that's supposed to be color-coded, they have a key, the example on the right, the colors overlap each other, so you end up with all kinds of combinations. And again, just way too much, too difficult to understand. So the whole idea of an infographic is, as soon as you see it, you know what it's talking about. It's a quick communication. Now, let's back up a little bit and talk about our brains and what's going on in our brains as we look at the infographics. The first thing you have to understand about how your brain works as a learning professional is where we came from. Our brain exists for one thing and one thing only, and that's to keep us alive. So as we evolved, our brain added capacity and it added certain talents, if you will, because they proved helpful in keeping the race alive. And that's why we have them today. The challenge is that in today's world, we're not living the same way that our ancient ancestors did in caveman days. And so we're not running away from saber-toothed tigers on the street, for example. So sometimes our brain responses are not real acceptable or useful in today's world, because it's going to take a while for our evolution to catch up with the world we live in today. And in fact, it may never catch up with the rate of change we're seeing. But understanding what that brain is doing for you and why it's doing what it's doing, it's incredibly important as a learning professional, and it helps us explain how infographics affect our brain. So the next thing you need to understand about your brain is what it's doing in terms of a term, neuroplasticity. You may have heard of it. You don't have to remember the term. What you have to remember is your brain is constantly changing itself. Up until about 10 years ago, scientists actually thought that when you hit about age 21, and so that number wasn't chosen arbitrarily to define an adult. There was science that showed that people tended, their personality and so on tended to get fixed around then. Well, they assumed that was because your brain wasn't growing, wasn't changing anymore. Then, about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, when it first started happening, we were able to look inside a living brain while it was working. And to the scientists' amazement, it was constantly changing. So these connections that you see here in this depiction, these are brain cells, and you can see that they are connected to each other, but it's not really static like this. They're constantly wiring and unwiring to respond to new information. So already you are physically different than you were when we started, because you're starting to think about new things and how you're going to imply them, and so your brain is adjusting in order to keep up. Those connections from neuron to neuron, that's how we access information. And so when we get new information, the neurons have to figure out a new pathway for us. Now, the other thing the brain does is if it notices you don't use that pathway, it disconnects those neurons so they can be used for something else, and that's that phrase, use it or lose it. So a wonderful thing that infographics do is they help us rewire our learners' brains in the first place by showing them new information and connecting it in multiple ways on that infographic. And then if they continue to look at it, or if we remind them to look at it after the training, it tells those pathways, we still need you. So they go back over it, and they should learn and see new insights and new connections. That's the beauty of an infographic. It's an incredibly rich, powerful tool to leave behind or to push out after training. Another reason why they work is they get our attention. This is actually a picture of my new puppy, Bella, in our back. And look at that. Look how intently she is looking. Animals usually show what they're thinking much more easily than humans, one reason why I like to use them. It gets attention. Now, some of you may have heard a recent statistic, it's been getting a lot of play, of how long the human being attention span actually is. It's a study Microsoft does every 4 years, and they were quite surprised to find this new number. Has anybody heard it? This would be a good chat question.
See, I'm seeing Amy saying 30 seconds. Diane, she actually asked a question. I'll come back to that one. No links more available to get their attention. Not heard it, but I'd guess 90 seconds or less from Jessica.
Okay, those are respectable guesses. So I think you'll be as surprised as I was to learn it's 8 seconds. Yeah, 8 seconds. If I'm holding a cookie, I think Bella can pay attention longer than that. And here's what's happening in our brain. The world we've built for ourselves is constantly tugging at us to look away. And you do this unconsciously. So you don't know that you're pulling away every 8 seconds. But subconsciously, what your brain is doing is it's scanning your environment to make sure it's still safe. So you might glance out the window, you might sneak a peek at an email, or a friend might be sending you an IM. And while you're doing those things, you might also notice the room is too hot or too cold. All those things to your brain are potential threats to survival, so it has to check them out. And then it goes back to what it's paying attention to, unless it finds something that it thinks is really concerning, and then it'll pay attention to that. So as learning professionals, something we have to know is we never really have someone's undivided attention, not for very long at least. That means we need to be prepared to reinforce and repeat our information and present it in as many different ways that we can to continue to pull that attention back. So another reason why infographics work so well is if you use compelling graphics, you can grab their attention. A compelling headline can get their attention, a headline or a title on that infographic. And here's what's happening as people are going to training. And this, unfortunately, is going to happen with you guys as you leave this webinar. And you've probably heard of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. What happens is we start forgetting new information 20 minutes after we've learned it. An hour later, we've lost 44% of the content. And that continues until we get down 31 days later at 21%. And that's assuming that we really paid attention and chose to learn it in the first place. So the other challenge for us as learning professionals is very often, I've seen this in my clients, and you probably experience it too, we don't get the opportunity to come back. Training is looked at as a one-time thing. Well, the more we can encourage the insertion of performance support tools, quick reference guides, tiny refresher videos, the more we can push that curve up. So if we have frequent reinforcement going on after the main learning event, we're going to have much more stickiness to the training. We're not going to have to retrain as often, and people will be able to actually apply it. A great way to do that would be to make an infographic of what was covered in class, maybe turn it into a poster that shows up on the workplace, or if you're in a virtual environment, send a printable PDF to folks. And there's probably some other ways you can think of. So another reason why I love these infographics is they fight the forgetting curve. And I hope that makes sense to everybody. And Ken, if you see any questions or comments, of course, I know you're going to let me know.
Yeah, there are some things in here. Patria is saying, is this what happens with ADD? Are we creating more people with this disorder?
Wonderful question, and I actually have a link to a very interesting article that is going to be at the end in the resources. It's called Is Google Making Us Stupid? And there's a lot of concern about the way we are distracting ourselves, and that we have in fact made our attention span shorter. We also tend to just skim the surface for information. There's a very good book about that called The Shallows. And the concern is that sometimes we need deep learning. We need to really dig in. Like, for example, if you're studying neuroscience, you can't just, kind of know what a neuron is and kind of know what neuroplasticity is. If you're going to really work with it, you've got to own that information. That takes time. It takes focus. It takes repetition. And those skills are starting to elude us. We don't use them as often in today's world, and that makes us sort of all suffering a bit from ADD. That is part of what I think we all need to battle, and understanding what's happening in our brains and how our brains are affected by what we do outside of work. And so most of us are, to some extent, online. We have those distractions. We've developed those patterns of just getting quick information, and we need to be teaching our learners how to learn. In fact, there is a very good MOOC that's done by a friend of mine. Some of you guys probably know about it because it is the #1 massive open online course on, I'm not sure which one of them it's on, but I can send you guys the link later. It's called Learning to Learn, where Barbara Oakley teaches people how their brain works and how to use those things so that you're learning better instead of letting the brain work against the learning process. And I think it's something that everybody needs to know. So I recommend that. It's free. It's very detailed. It'll teach you a lot about the brain, and you'll have to actually engage in deep learning as you're doing it. So it gives you a good example. So I love that question. Thank you, Ken. Was there anything else we want to talk about on this one about forgetting and distraction?
I think, and Joe, if I don't interpret this right, just chime back in. But he was asking, he was saying, and is this why when a presenter reinforces what they say, it leaves participants feeling like it was a good presentation? I think in your reference to helping people with forgetting.
Yes. Yeah. And, you know, as learning professionals, and you can tell by looking at me, I've been doing this for a few years. Before we had neuroscience, we still knew a lot of these things. We knew it intuitively, and we knew it because we saw the evidence. So my first training manager taught me, you do tell, say, do. And I still practice that today. You tell people what we're going to talk about, and then you give them the information, and then you have them do something with it. And what you're doing is you're hitting that forgetting curve. You're repeating the information, but in different ways. You're revisiting it and digging a little deeper each time. And a good instructional designer is already doing this. They know it. What you might not know is the research says there is actually a golden number, a number of times information has to be repeated in a training session before it will get moved from short-term memory to long-term memory in most situations in most brains. And that number is 8. So you have to revisit it 8 times. That is why we repeat things, we do reviews, we do debriefs, we do quizzes, because we know, just as learning professionals, we already know that this stuff is all true.
And thanks for jumping in here, Diane, because I saw this earlier, and then I was helping somebody get in and didn't see the context. But she's asking, does stress have a direct impact? How is stress involved in this?
Oh, brain under stress, now that you think about that survival imperative, is focused on the stress and on how to survive that threat. So let's say you're trying to train people who know that layoffs are coming Monday. Their brains are not in the right place to be learning. They're thinking about, will I have a job or not? If they are just in an environment, there was a very interesting study done about doctors and how we put these doctors through these torturous double shifts when they're learning. The idea being, you know, trial by fire, we're going to make them work really hard, we're going to make them work 20 hours a day, and that is somehow going to make them better doctors. All it does is make them exhausted, prone to mistakes, and they find it much harder to concentrate and learn. So stress is the enemy of learning. Great comment, great question. Thank you for bringing
Joe,
that up.
I see your hand up. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you had something you wanted to share or ask. So you should be able to talk now.
I'm sorry, I was just playing with buttons trying to figure out how to get my chat thing back up. My apologies.
Is that the ADD
No worries.
that we were talking about? Or?
It was, yeah, basically. I was just like, what are all these buttons? And my chat box disappeared.
You know, Joe, you could probably show me why I'm not seeing my chat. I probably haven't hit the right button yet. But thank you for your honesty. And you know what? Fiddling actually helps your brain. So with this idea of attention...
I just want to let Anshul know that we are recording this and it should be posted on the YouTube, ATD Houston YouTube channel.
Yeah, yeah, and while we're talking about the forgetting curve, and I do need to move on pretty soon, I would encourage all of you, even though you've attended, to go back and play through that because you're going to get something more out of the second time around. And if you're not taking notes, it'd be a good idea to start jotting a few things down, just thoughts as they come to you. Hey, I might want to try this. Here's what I want to do differently, or hey, we already do this, aren't we great, kind of stuff. So, so with that, let's go on. Sorry, talk about buttons. I think I hit the wrong one. I was about to talk about cognitive load. We actually started the program with this, even though I didn't introduce the term, when I showed you those crazy busy infographics. That is the absolute opposite of what we want to do. This image is a great depiction of what happens when somebody is learning. At the moment of attention, they're bringing information in through their senses, their eyes, their ears. It could also be physical, through touch. If you're, say, doing something in a classroom setting, face-to-face, and you're having people build a model or something, it could be sense, it could be taste. It's all the senses. It comes in first to short-term working memory, which is extremely limited. It can hold on to 3 to 5 thoughts at a time. That's why if you are going to the store and you're picking up just a couple of things, you're good, you'll remember it. But if, as you're walking out the door, your partner adds 2 or 3 things more, you'll never remember it unless you write it down, because the working memory can't hold that much. As you're learning something new, the working memory is constantly encoding that information and moving it into long-term memory. And what it's doing is it's looking for neurons that are somehow connected to that information and connecting new information to them to make it easier to retrieve later. This wonderful system breaks down if too much information hits that working memory too quickly, because it just can't handle it. And when that happens, your brain actually works slower, not faster, trying to focus on what's most important. And so if you throw too much information at a learner, particularly, say, a new hire or somebody in a new role, they physically can't handle the information, and that adds to stress, which we know is also not good for learning. So we really want to space information as it comes in. We want to keep it in small chunks. The nice thing about an infographic, even though at first you might say, wait a minute, there's a chunk of information here, but the secret is the learner doesn't take it in all at once. They look at one corner, then they look at another corner, and as they're doing it, they determine the pace of bringing the information into their brain at a pace that's comfortable for them. So that's another reason why infographics are so effective in learning, is it avoids cognitive load. And here's an example of a quick little infographic that I've done that tells you the #1 reason why the brain's language is in infographics. It's visual. One of the first terms we threw out when we asked about a definition is, several of you said, it's a visual tool. It expresses information visually. And I want you to notice a couple of things. What do you think? You saw some really terrible infographics. Let's see if we can pick out some things that are really good.
And before we get into that, I don't mean to interrupt you, but Cody had asked a question about can you or do you do some sort of assessment to determine how much someone can take in at a time?
There is such an assessment. There are several such assessments, and if you're interested, it's not something I do personally in my practice, but I can connect you with those tools. One of my clients is a manufacturer of dials and instruments that are used by airline pilots. And if you've ever looked in the cockpit of a major airline, you've seen how crazy those cockpits are. They're full of instrumentation. And what they do is, in real time, they measure the cognitive load of the pilot and co-pilot. They do that by watching eye movements, because when you start to hit cognitive overload, instead of scanning a wide range, like a 180-degree range for your information, you start narrowing it. You get tunnel vision, and you're only looking straight ahead. So you're missing what's going on in the periphery. And they know at that point that's a very dangerous situation for the pilot and all the passengers. So if the system recognizes that the pilot is experiencing that, it automatically adjusts the display to show only the absolute basic survival information, things like the plane's elevation, speed, wind shear alarms, things like that. And all the other things that are not important are dimmed to help the pilot focus. It delivers the important information where they know those eyes are focusing right in the middle, and it will continue to do that until the pilot starts to widen his scan, and then it will come up as he has been relieved of cognitive load. So I just found that amazing when I worked with them on that project. So yes, there are ways to test for that, and while certain people are better at it than others, the truth is we all can suffer from that, and we all share the same limitations. There's only so much better you can be at working that short-term memory. You can train it to get a little better by practice, but ultimately it's, you know, it's like trying to put water in a bucket that's full. There's a limit to it. Thank you, Kim. Was there anything else we wanted to cover?
No, we're good right now.
Okay. All right, well, let's take a look at this little infographic. Remembering those really not optimal bad examples that we had before, what are some of the things you like about this one?
And I'll comment on them as we see them come in. I'm not seeing any come in right this second.
Well, that's because they're looking at it.
And I want to, yeah, I was going to say, so while we're waiting too, again, just like we were able to unmute for Joe, if somebody wanted to speak theirs, we can hit it that way.
Great.
But I see some coming in here. Cody is saying easily displayed into 4 basic quadrants. Jessica, color scheme. Tanisha, easy to understand and comprehend. Keith, font sizes, highlighting importance. David, simple and pleasant colors. Patria, simple pictures. Carolina, the graphics support the information and reinforce it.
Yeah, those are all absolutely true and exactly what I was going for as I put this together. And here's another interesting thing about being a learning professional.
Visually softer, less harsh colors, organized fonts.
Yeah, and I love those colors, by the way. It's a personal bias, so I'm lucky that they're also attractive. Notice what just happened there. I didn't have to tell you guys anything. I presented the information. I let you observe it and draw your own conclusions. And we all know that the stage on the stage is over, that era of training. So very often I'm able to encourage my clients to do less explaining and just provide opportunities to explore, which is what we just did. So I asked you to look at the structure of the infographic and how it's organized. And you guys picked up all the major points that I'm going to cover. So I'm going to get another repetition when I get to them. The other thing I'd like you to notice is now let's look at the data that's on there. The biggest thing that I want you to pay attention to is the brain processes visuals 60,000 times faster than text. 60,000 times. That's why you can often get an impression of something before you really know, before you can even audibilize what you're thinking. You get that, we call it a gut in. Malcolm Gladwell famously wrote the book Blink about it. It's because our brain is so incredibly fast at processing visuals, because long before we could speak, we could see. And that is how we survived. Some of these other stats are also very interesting. 90% of the information coming into your brain is visual. Your eyes get much more of the real estate to move into the brain on their pathways. Your brain is always spending about half of its effort processing the visuals. So right now, your brain, even as it's bouncing around on its attention, it's paying attention to the little video of me in the corner. It's paying attention to what you see on the screen. It's maybe paying attention to your notes or your work environment. And 50% of that is visual. So that is why, ultimately, bottom line, that's why we want to produce infographics for our learners, is because they're the most powerful way to talk to the brain, the way the brain wants to learn. Anything else we want to cover on this one, Ken, or questions that have come up?
If anybody has anything, go ahead and chat it in, or again, if you raise your hand, I'll scan to see if anybody wants to share any comments or questions. I think we're good to move on.
All right. Now I'm giving you some sites here because the good news is you don't have to create these from scratch. In fact, one of the greatest tools for making an infographic is probably already on your PC, and that's Microsoft PowerPoint. You just need to change the page setting to make it a longer, narrower page rather than the standard presentation page. But in addition to PowerPoint, there are online sites, and these are just a few. These are a few of the top ones. I've used Vinage and HubSpot, and all of them actually are free, and they give you a range of options. And then it's it's kind of plug and click. You can pull in your data and design an effective infographic. And remember, we're going to give you these slides, so you'll have these links. And there probably are others that I'm not aware of. There's plenty of tools out there. What is not necessarily readily apparent, though, is the process. And so what I want to talk about now is how do you, now that we understand how very important they are, how do we put them together? So I have 7 steps that I use, and I think they're pretty effective. You start with what is your story? What is it you really want to tell people? Are you summarizing a class or a concept? Are you introducing a set of data that you want them to draw a conclusion about? If you want them to draw a conclusion, for example, you want to convey the visuals in a way that leads to that conclusion. So let's say I'm doing an infographic on climate change, and I want people to be concerned. Then I would make sure that my graphic showed some scary things happening. I might say have a picture of the polar ice cap and show it shrinking, and as it's shrinking, the ocean levels are rising. Excuse me. And so if I wanted to tell a different story, I would organize that differently.
I think we're losing Margie here for a second. And Margie,
I apologize, guys. I'm back.
And we
Can
have,
you see me?
Yeah, we see you. We hear you. And we have a question too. It's from Diane. She's asking, she's noticed that, many infographics are not easily printable to a page or two. It's like, why is that? What's she missing about that? Why do people do that?
Diane, the reason they're doing that is they've designed it for the web and for mobile devices. You're going to see more and more things on the web that are long and narrow and you have to scroll down to if you're on a computer, because what they're trying to do is make it easy for you to grab your cell phone and scroll with your finger. And they're doing that for a very good reason, because the statistics show that every year more people are getting all their information, or the majority of their information, off their smartphone, not off a laptop or a desktop computer. And that's going to hit us all in the learning profession too, and I'm sure a few of you are already starting to design for the mobile user. And it's also because the infographic started with online news and online media that is trying to sell something. And so they were always geared to that mobile audience. If you want to make it printable, you just have to manage the size, and you might make more than one page. So when you design in PowerPoint, you have some built-in dimensions that you can choose that will make it a nice 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 14, I think, the longer paper size. Those are the 2 standard paper sizes you can normally print off any printer. So it's not so much a psychological reason or a neuroscience reason, it's really more of a marketing reason and how they expect the users to use this information. So I would make an infographic different and probably longer for an e-learning course than I would if I were going to use it in a classroom. Let me just check with Diane and the rest of the group. Did that make sense?
Did Diane maybe give us a hands up or something if it did, or chat in or whatever? Yeah, she said, however, baby, and I figured she was going to go here. You know, she's talking about those people that just love to print everything. Everything needs printed, like the baby boomers.
Yeah, yeah. I have my mother-in-law lives with us, so I thought for a second, I don't think she'll hear me. She's around to hear me, but she prints like every email, and I can't seem to break her of that habit. So yeah. That's a challenge. And, you know, if people want printable versions, you can go to the extra effort of making a different version that maybe parses the data different so it can be printed on multiple pages. But ultimately, I think the first thing is figure out for yourself how you're going to use it. And that dictates the structure and the size. And so what we're talking about on that process, that the first one is what story do we really want to tell? What picture do we want them to have in their heads? And then what data supports it? Now from there, start flipping through those templates and find one that fits the story you want to tell. So I happen to pick this one here, which is about learning and education, and this is a template. So you can put information in it. I think it would be an excellent shape for an infographic if I were doing it, say, about creativity or learning, because that light bulb image tends to represent that to us. But what happens sometimes is people pick the template first and then try to fit their message and their data to the template, and then it doesn't always work. So always get it in your head first, and then you will find the right template for your infographic. Now, if you're just a brilliant graphic designer, of course, you don't need to use a template. You can start from scratch. But I am a big lover of templates. I'm not a graphic artist. I don't have a lot of time to, whoever originally designed this, that took some time. So being able to grab that, change the text, put my data, and so bigger pieces of data would probably go on those lines off to the side. You know, it saves me a lot of time as long as it really is compatible with what I want to say. So that would be one of the things. Be very careful with templates. That's not the first step. That's the third step. And now it's a matter of plugging in your data as little as possible. And I'm going to just flip back because I want us to take a look at the brain
And while you're
example.
doing that, Margie, Robert had he made a comment and said, you know, one of the tricks he's used in designing a printed version of most of his courses that are delivered via e-learning, so that those that do want the printed copy can print one. So he kind of already knows he's going to have a lot of people that are going to want to print it, and so instead of probably dealing with it when it happens, he's like, you know what, it's better just to say, okay, yeah, here's the printed version. Go crazy with your printed self.
There you go. And you know, there's a real benefit to taking notes by hand. It's actually, and we're not, that could be a whole other webinar, but that's one reason why people want it, is intuitively they know they learn better if they write something down and they like writing it on a picture of the slide. So there's a real valid learning principle going on there when people are asking for printed materials that unfortunately in our effort to be green we sometimes lose. So giving them at least a few pages that they can write on is always a best practice in my opinion. And I just wanted to flip back to this to show one of the things you guys called out is that these percentages were much bigger to draw my attention, and that the pictures matched what I then talked about. These gears are a metaphor for process. The magnifying glass, now that I'm looking at it, could probably mean a lot of things. I matched it to response to the visuals. And then we have those sensory reactions, those are little neurons firing, and art, you know, the idea of the brain being so visual. So match your data to images and use as little text as possible, and that can be a challenge. So the text is there to clarify. The pictures should tell as much of the story as possible. Now, another thing I found is that a lot of people stop there and they say, hey, I made an infographic, and they add it to their training. And it doesn't always come off as well as they would think, because you know what it's supposed to say. So something called the expectation effect comes in. The expectation effect is that your brain is constantly predicting what's going to happen based on past experience. It does that, again, you know, it's a survival tool that we use so that you're ready for things. So, for example, when you came into this webinar, you've been on webinars before, and you predict what's going to happen. You don't do this consciously unless you make an effort to, but subconsciously your brain is expecting certain things to happen. If we did something wildly different, it would get your attention. It would also spike that alarm in your brain about survival. Say, hey, something different's going on. I better really pay attention here. So when you are the one who created something, your brain is expecting it to communicate what you intended. And that's why it's very difficult to proofread your own work or to evaluate whether or not your training is really effective. So I recommend you always ask somebody else to take a look, preferably not a learning professional, a friend, a spouse, a partner, or a little pilot group, and ask them, what do you get out of this? What do you think are the key salient points out of this infographic? Get some feedback. For example, if what I'm trying to convey with this light bulb is creativity, and somebody says what they got out of it is pieces of the puzzle, I'll have to, because those are puzzle pieces making up the light bulb, I have to ask myself, is that okay? It might actually be better. If it's not okay, I might want to say, you know, I don't want a metaphor that's really two metaphors, a piece and a light bulb. Let me just do a light bulb. Or maybe I would just do a puzzle. So that's the kind of tweaking you might do after you get some feedback. And then you're able to use it. And usually one time through is enough. But I'm sure you guys all know this. Every class you teach, you learn something. I learn as much from the people I teach as what I hope I convey to them. So you'll probably continue to tweak your infographics. And of course, sometimes data changes. You have to update it for that. So Ken, how are we doing on comments, questions on this 7-step process?
Well, Joe actually had a question, not necessarily related to the process, but he was curious about, you know, where would you get some infographics that might not be just overly expensive?
Now, do you want ones that are already populated with information, or you want templates that you can use?
Yeah, what do you think, Joe? I can unmute you. If you wanted to unmute, you could talk or just text it in, whichever you prefer. You're unmuted. You just need to unmute yourself now.
Fantastic. Hey, sorry about that. I guess it would be something to the effect of, like, you know, you have all these websites where you can grab, like, photo stock and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be like a photo stock type of place for infographics where, you know, you have, like, from what we're looking at right now, like, you know, clouds or globes or people or computers or things like that, that one could piece it together themselves. Ideally, not for high cost, but I'm assuming if there's a place that doesn't exist, it's going to have some money attached to it.
Right. Well, there are some sites that are free if you use them for education purposes. The challenge is that they're often very limited. The ones that have really great selections also come with a price tag. Now, I happen to use one that is, I think, very good, and it's a little less expensive. It's an annual subscription, and I have no connection with them. I'm not advertising them, but it's called PhotoSpin. And what I like about it is there are levels of subscription, so depending on how many images you think you're going to need, and I have never gone over my limit, and I've got the mid-range. And as you can imagine, I use a lot of images. So I would check them out. And I would also really do look at those free sessions and see if you can find any. And yeah, the website, as Ken has reminded me, is www.photospinaltogether.com. So that would be one to check out. If you, my email is going to be given at the end of the class, Joe, so if you want to follow up with me and you're really having a particular challenge, I can certainly, and I'll make that offer to everybody. If there's anything you're looking for, you're not getting it directly out of this session, it's a follow-up question, or you need some more resources or advice, please feel free to engage me. I'll be happy to get back in touch and help you. Any other questions or comments on this one?
Waiting to see if we get any. There weren't any in there. See if anybody has any last-minute comments or questions before we move on. Just taking a quick peek here at the list too. I think we're good.
Okay. Okay, now here is a partial list of resources. And some of the things that I have put on here are brain resources, and some of them are infographics resources. One of the things that is interesting as a book, if you just want to look at great examples, is Nate Silver's book, Best American Infographics, and he's probably about ready to update it. So some of these are articles, some of these are books. Something that is still very relevant that was published a long time ago is by the late Carl Sagan, who was actually an astronomer, but he wrote a lot about human intelligence and how the brain works, and it turns out that he was very, very right, way ahead of his time. So if you can find The Dragons of Eden, I highly recommend it for anyone who loves learning. Very personal favorite of mine. And I would love to continue to connect with you guys. I have a newsletter, which, by the way, is formatted like an infographic to some extent, and that's completely free. I have a podcast, and I also teach a class for ATD on the brain-based learning essentials, and you can catch that as an ATD member. You can sign up for that. It's an online class, and in fact, we're starting another class in November. And I think you've probably heard or seen in the write-ups about my book, I'm Very Proud of Brain Matters, How to Help Anyone Learn Anything Using Neuroscience. So what we've got now is we've actually got a little bit of extra time for Q&A. So let's go ahead and use this to the best of our advantage. What questions do you guys have?
And I do see Veronica's hand up. So Veronica, I've unmuted your microphone. We should be able to hear you if you wanted to make a comment or ask a question. And if you were like Joe earlier and you just, were clicking around playing with buttons, that's okay too. But I know we had talked about anybody that wanted to make a comment or ask a question, you could raise your hand. I see you've muted yourself. So I'm going to see that she says she's sorry. So we'll go ahead and mute you. And I see Patria is asking, is there a difference in the way adult brains and teenage brains take in information? I'm not an expert, but I have a teenager, so from experience, I would say absolutely.
Yeah, I'm going to say the information is not, the way they take it in is not different, because that's an unconscious process, but what they do with it is very different. So, if you would, and who asked that, Patra?
Yes.
Patra,
yes.
if you would, and I hope I'm not butchering your name, but if you would send me an email to remind me, I can send you, or I can send you some links about the teenage brain. There's been a lot of great research about it. One of the things about a teenage brain is that it is not as good at evaluating risk, which is why they tend to do more risky things. To their brain, which hasn't had certain experiences yet, not completely informed, of course, but it's, it's still learning, still growing. There is actually a part of the brain that evaluates risk that is not fully developed. And so teenagers will be given information, for example, on drunk driving, and their brain, perceives the information, it brings it in, but instead of encoding it as, hey, this is very dangerous, it might just encode it as, oh, that was interesting. So one of the things we have to be very aware of with teenagers is we really have to label and call out, don't do this, if we want them to get the message. subtlety is not necessarily going to get through to that teenage brain. Another thing that is very important for a teenage brain is belonging. We are hardwired to want to be part of a group. And that actually goes back to one of the reasons human beings survived instead of Neanderthals, because they were both alive at the same time. Neanderthals tended to stay in tiny little groups, like a clique, and human beings stayed in a much larger tribe that might have 20, 30, 40 families together, and they could all watch out after each other. They could protect the children, they could take turns keeping watch, they could go out and hunt. And so that was a huge advantage to keeping us alive. So we've now evolved to where we need other people. We physically need them. You will get physically ill if you are kept in isolation for too long a time. And teenagers are extremely heightened in this need. It is almost a desperation, which explains a lot of behavior, like whether you're popular or not, worrying about that, getting on Facebook and trying to have lots of friends and worrying about that public image to absolute strangers, you know, who might see it. All of those things are, it's wiring that's in your brain, and it is compelling that teenager to belong because there's safety in numbers. But sometimes that wiring leads them into groups that aren't necessarily helpful. So you have to be very aware that this is a deep-seated, unconscious, not even a desire, it's a need, it's a drive, that belonging, and help steer them to belonging experiences and groups that are going to be supportive and positive. So I could go on and on, actually, which is why I asked you to send me an email if you want more information about the teenage brain and what's different about it. But I'm going to say one more thing, because this matters to every one of us. Even if you don't have a teenager in your family, I can almost guarantee you have one in the workplace. And here's why. The teenage brain doesn't stop being a teenage brain until the mid to late 20s. And so when we're talking about teenagers from a neuroscience, neurological perspective, we're talking about young adults as well. And that is often lost in the workplace, but it explains a lot of the needs of your younger employees, your younger learners, and how you need to address them. So I would just encourage you to keep in mind that that term teen, from a more specific, accurate scientific definition, encompasses the 20s as well. Okay, Ken, other questions on that or another subject?
And it's Patria. She did it phonetically for us.
Oh, thank you, Patria. I look forward to hearing from you about your questions.
And she also was kind of asking about millennials versus Gen Xers or baby boomers. I know we're about out of time, though, but and she said she'd follow up with you. But
okay,
that's another thing. We
well,
have minutes if you want to say a few things.
Yeah. I'll just say very quickly that personally, I think a lot of those so-called differences have been somewhat exaggerated. I personally identify with a lot of the descriptions of millennials myself, although I'm technically a baby boomer. So I've observed that people are people, brains are brains, and while there are differences and they're important, we're far more alike than we are different. And I'll just get off my soapbox on that. And I know, Ken, you have a couple things you need to wrap up. So I'm just going to thank you guys for spending time with me, for being so engaged, having so many great questions. I look forward to seeing your infographics. If you come up with one and you'd like to share it, I would love to feature it in one of my future newsletters. So let's keep the conversation going, and thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Ken.
And Cody, I see your hand up. You're unmuted if you wanted to share something.
Yeah, I was just curious about the, you were talking about the difference between teenagers and the brain of older people. And it's just is this an encoding thing where you need that repetition and that consequence of the experience to solidify that pathway where it gets so strong that they are able to discern, hey, this is dangerous?
Yeah, absolutely. It takes a lot more emphasis, and you can't be subtle. To trigger the alarm response in their brain, it has to be very, very clear and very, very dangerous. If it otherwise, there's a risk it gets interpreted as and gets shuttled off to something as not dangerous, and it might not even make it into long-term memory.
And for these pathways, could you kind of liken this to a small strand of string, and then as it builds and builds, it becomes more cable-like, it kind of thickens?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's exactly what's happening. The more you go over a pathway, the more those neurons that are in that pathway recruit others and say, hey guys, this is important. Come over here. So that is a wonderful metaphor, and there's a saying neuroscientists like to say, neurons that wire together fire together, and it's meant to say the more they wire together, the more they send out that information to the rest of the brain. So it just gets bigger and bigger the more you use it.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that brings us to the end of our time. Janet, is there anything you wanted to say or share?
Just want to thank you so much, Margie, for giving us such an informative webinar. I took plenty of notes, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you in the near future. And I hope everybody enjoyed our session today, and I hope you all got a lot out of it and took a lot of notes like I did. And thank you all for attending, and you guys have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everybody.